In chapter 26, we're going to begin with the movement from imperial to regional kingdoms before moving on to changes in African religion. We're going to focus on both West and East Africa, starting with the Songhai Empire in West Africa. So beginning in West Africa with the Songhai Empire, or the Songhai Empire, excuse me. This was an Islamic empire. They carried out the imperial tradition of Mali and reached their peak in the 15th century under the leadership of Sunni Ali. Songhai rulers, as you could tell from that name, like their Mali predecessors, were Islamic. And under their patronage, Timbuktu became a center of learning and culture. This is where we find records of the Epic of Sundiata, a Mali king whose story was recorded by griots and then written down. Changing economic times, especially the rising prominence of the Atlantic trade, fostered a move away from larger imperial states towards regional ones. And this was partially because of the weakening of the trans-Saharan trade. It did not disappear, but Songhai had relied on the trans-Saharan trade for a lot of their wealth. And so when its importance diminished and coastal kingdoms started to become more important, as we saw with the map of Africa, the Songhai also were weakened. Their empire ended when they were attacked by a Moroccan army who was given firearms from Europeans, and these weapons just outdid the other, their own weapons. In the east, you had the Swahili city-states suffering a similar, although also very different fate. The Swahili had been powerful for a very long time, participating in the Indian Ocean Basin trade. Now, this trade did not diminish at this time. However, the Portuguese, as they moved through this area, used gunboat diplomacy, literally gunning down with their cannons these different port cities, and then set up bases of control. Now, the new power in Africa was these regional coastal kingdoms, and they gained their power by participating in the slave trade. So they would raid the interior for slaves from different regional bases who were not their own and bring them to the coast where those same slaves would be purchased by Europeans. So Dahomey, Congo, and Oyo are three examples of this. You can see their locations here on the map. Here's Congo. Another kingdom that is mentioned in your book is Ndongo, which eventually loses power to the Europeans and becomes the first colony of Angola. And up here you have Dahomey and the Ashanti and Oyo, other trading kingdoms. Now, it's easy to assume, or it's often assumed, I shouldn't say it's easy to assume, that Europeans were able to directly take control of these different kingdoms. But check out the power dynamic, in this photo. Here you have the king of Congo, and who eventually became a Christian, by the way. And here are the Europeans who are wanting to trade with them. The Europeans clearly know that the Congo king has the power. And in many cases, it is true that African royal kingdoms, were running the show. Now we're going to transition and look at religion. As is the usual case, religion and social pressures went hand in hand with these political changes brought by invading Europeans. In this case, first Islam and then Christianity challenged the animistic or nature-based beliefs of the Africans. And not surprisingly, as we have learned over and over, both of these religions became popular, but in syncretic or blended versions. So we're going to look at two blends. One is Islam. We'll start there. And in Islam, usually in Africa, women were much more elevated and much less, separated than in other Islamic societies. However, this was not always the case. There was a group of people in West Africa called the Fulani, actually kind of in modern Nigeria. So you can sort of think of them as an ancient version of Boko Haram, because they wanted to impose a strict form of Islam. And they fought many wars with the powers in Western Africa in order to try to enact that type of strict Islam. They were powerful they took some power until the 1800s. When Christianity was brought to Africa, it was also used in syncretic versions. So, for example, kings like was done with the Songhai Empire, kings would sometimes turn to Christianity and then encourage their people to convert to it, like Alfonso I in Congo. Africans also, just like those that we learned about in the Americas, made Christianity more compatible with their beliefs and their cultures. One example of this is a woman from Congo, Dona Beatrix, who said that she saw visions of Jesus and that he was a black African. Now, this is kind of interesting because it's similar to the Virgin Guadalupe, the Virgin Mary, seen in Mexico City on an earlier ancient shrine, but also because Europeans had this idea that Jesus was a white dude, so a white European guy, when he was from the Middle East, so he wouldn't have been an Italian, as he was often depicted, or a Englishman. But nevertheless, Donna Beatrix was killed. She was actually burned at the stake by the King of Congo for her visions, but her ideas did make an impact and they did last in Africa.